Hello, all, and for this one, I guess I wanted to kind of throw my hat into the arena for this kind of trending topic or whatever. And I'd much rather go off and do my own thing, but the subject's gonna come up anyway, so why not make use of that? I guess you don't want to just dwell on topics forever and just kind of just cast yourself off to the side without any kind of like relevance. um so I wanted the guys kind of cover cancel culture, but obviously not so much in the kind of minutia of Eminem and his music or anything like that, but more to kind of discuss what this kind of really means to like cancel something. Usually it's uh, based off of the kind of like these behaviors of these kind of like priestly like Twitter verified attitudes. um, and it's kind of really stuck up, and uh, it really just kind of has that kind of like bourgeois attitude to it, and it's just kind of like staunch, absolute, you know, kind of just that concrete, mindset that just can't be broken into. Like you can't just, there's no exposure to them really for the most part. Like, and I've really noticed that, as I kind of look back on myself and I wonder in the future, and it kind of almost excites me in a way to think like I'll look back on some of my content, and I already do this on some of my writings anyway over the years, and it'll just be like, well, like I'll just laugh at just some of my takes because it'll just be like, well, you're fucking wrong on that, or like I think the complete opposite now, and kind of just that interaction with your own like I don't know, intellectual canon and how you kind of perceive it. I think it's exciting. I think it's sad when people don't kind of get into that stuff and they just get kind of stagnant like that. And so that's kind of really the attitude that really stems from the idea that you're just gonna like, cancel an artist or cancel something because of, some kind of like unsettling attitude. And if you want to go at it from a political angle, like I've tried to do on this channel, I'd say this is kind of really a reaction to, kind of the wealth inequality and, maybe even, kind of low social status that you would experience in real life. People go online and they're able to kind of coordinate together, and it's almost able to make this kind of new, like, it's actually kind of like this enforced social currency. And throughout American history, if you look like kind of like the Puritan like first wave feminists, and it wasn't just these kind of victories. Women's like History Month is celebrating in like legislation and like these kind of like rights, um, but there was more to it, and like prohibition, and like they were one of the forefront, moral busybodies of bringing about prohibition, and all of the problems that came with that their own politics would reflect on. But that's when you kind of when you see history, and I guess this is kind of going in tandem with, each month has almost a different flavor of kind of this minoritarian group having their own history month. And it's totally brought down almost to just these kind of identities and achievements. Ultimately, that does take place in a structure of the West in their own thoughts of what is considered the good life anyway. And so, I think that's one of the main themes I'm trying to get at in kind of this like cancel culture narrative is, what actually comes after that, and what is the art, and kind of what is the contribution, as I kind of looked in Quantities of Color in that video like a week ago, where I was just saying, like, these kind of global corporations are trying to commodify and bring together this person of color experience, especially in America, as if there isn't a whole lineage of history and their own interaction with that kind of empire. And that kind of misses the point of like culture in general and traditions of kind of like these like sets of social norms and myths. And when you have an environment comes in contact with something, there's this John David Ebert's kind of like 3-part Dangerous Visions series, I think it was, that he did this last summer. That was really good and kind of like helped inspire me for this video. And he was kind of talking about how like natives and superheroes are actually influential to New York City in relation to the Jewish authors that wrote the series. And it was like because it was like some op-ed about superheroes being cops, and he just like blew it the fuck out basically. It was a really good series. I'd recommend it. But yeah, so when you have kind of like, whether it's these kind of like power dynamics of like white colonialism or something, when they're interacting, they're ultimately interacting with this kind of environment, and whether you like it or not, whether they have an uppity attitude or a bourgeois attitude towards it, or even a destructive attitude towards it, those implications are still, that those myths are still going to imprint on their own myths, and it's going to create a kind of new, these things don't just flow on the kind of there's a multitude to these kind of things, and there's currents within them. And so like this idea that it's all just like put together in this kind of like literal progressive picture is just I think it just kind of misses the point. And yeah, so I think that's one of the big critiques that you could come away with kind of like this postmodern takes that you see all the time on these political hack outlets, and these kind of attacks on these kind of like white Western Anglo, to be specific, and not just Anglo, but this is like what complicates it, is that like the Anglo does love to appropriate, and so like the English language is just it's so dominant because it's filled with so much different concepts and words from other cultures, because they have a way of seeing these kind of like utility and like appreciation for something and wanting to incorporate those ideas. And so like ultimately that's all it's not like these things are transcendental to this like racial minority groups, as if they're like some free will. This is like why I argue they're just like kind of they don't really have much of a say in anything, not just because of how many people are in the room, but it's because they don't understand their placement in history at all. They don't understand, even if they're coming at it from a resentful way, which I don't. But you would think that they would understand why they need to understand the features of kind of the enemy they're going up against, but I guess that's what happens when you just kind of go down that road of just these kind of like ideological paths, and just seeing a scapegoat. And I think they're more than that, and kind of pushing away from these kind of like political dynamics and talking about it from a different way. But this is another reason why I think everyone kind of you just kind of see this unsettling feeling really especially on the internet and kind of like internet culture, which is like really important to take in to kind of understand what's really going on at this point. And so you always just have this kind of, well, most brands and these products that are put towards you are kind of like these nostalgia brands. And pre-COVID, like one of the main features of all these kind of like parties you would go to or be invited at were all these like hipster revival like eras, 60s night, 70s night, and these identities ultimate, like what was our identity at that time really. And it was just these constant callbacks to these past eras, ultimately because we've gone down this path of really deconstructing. But I guess if you want to look at it more in the zeitgeist of every day, is just this cancel culture, and we ultimately have nothing to actually contribute to put in place of that, and we've never even bothered to ask the questions of why that is at all to begin with. And that just shows how the only way that's been represented for so long is just through this kind of resentful attitude. And one of the kind of funny exercises I've been inviting some of my friends to do lately is when you see these kind of hot take op-eds by these progressive groups about white empiricism and white privilege, and actually look at it and kind of affirm it and just be like, that's, well, I mean, maybe there's actually some good to that, and actually understanding the relationship for why something like empiricism would be worth redeeming, not just because it's seen as kind of just something that you just do or gone about that was just like handed down to you, but in an actual like affirming way, in an actual like positive fashion. I've been like kind of like pointing this out about something like free speech and these kind of like Bill of Rights, and we kind of neo-reactionaries, tons of better quality videos about kind of like what rights actually mean for like the relation with like the state and stuff like that. But it's still though, like these things were still interesting. Like there still is that kind of like, even if it was kind of like a mass delusion on how it's like gone about and brought in a power sense, ultimately people still like the concept of free speech, or people still want these kind of things and are willing to defend them, even in death. So I think that's kind of like trying to look at it differently, and maybe something that we can look at ourselves in the mirror about, and like what is actually something that we consider, not just because there's the utility of it being good in this kind of greater social scheme of things, but how we actually want to be treated in a political sense to each other, and actually getting to the knit and bones of something more like a, I guess you would say in the kind of Carl Schmitt like kind of friend or foe way, as opposed to just these abstract arguments, instead of like seeing people for being actual flesh and blood, instead of just these kind of like figures and demographs. And this state has so many delegates. And I was talking to my buddy earlier, and we were I mentioned the kind of term the Rust Belt, because I was showing him this meme, and we kind of both were agreeing that like the Rust Belt really is kind of reductionary. Like it's kind of actually like a term that I don't really like, that just seems like just kind of comes from like some New York Times like back room to, you know, kind of represent the backwardness, but ultimately like the value of like these electoral delegates. But you know, is that actually measuring our real production? It's just these kind of like population values. And you know, I'm not saying that I understand what, you know, the electoral college is set out to do and like the pragmatic of it in this kind of like, you know, democracy sense, but I'm actually like attacking it. So yeah, I think that also kind of highlights in general when it comes to when you look at, you know, the postmodern authors and the hypocrisy of it. So they kind of looked at it from, well, you know, everything's all relative. These concepts were ultimately made out of these kind of like power dynamics. They're not actually backed up by, you know, any kind of transcendental reasoning or rationale or anything like that. But you know, what do they do themselves but just kind of keep reasserting, you know, the canon as, you know, the most important. They don't, it's not like they're going to go off and, you know, learn, you know, Chinese metaphysics or something like that. They're not going to be interested in that at all. And so like when you look kind of like these minoritarian politics, it's like, okay, once again, that's the kind of the theme of quantum. I know I'm kind of like almost bridging these videos together again, but you know, it's kind of like, well, ultimately they still kind of go down this road, and their measures of success is measured in like blah blah blah, achieve this in science, and you know, these concepts that are still ultimately rooted in white men. And as if like being able to point that out and assert that and notice the identity nature of that to begin with wouldn't be like an Anglo thought in and of itself. So yeah, it's just kind of like funny and almost, well, it's not really funny actually, because you know, people are, you know, you have these young minds in college, and I've talked to a lot of not a lot, that was a silly term, but I've talked to some people now that I'm outside of academia, but they're kind of still in academia, and you know, they actually do kind of have this these like goggles of actually judging these kind of like authors based off of, you know, what their personal personal convictions are, but not in a kind of way of like, oh, you know, this is why maybe he was fixated on this like subject or something, and kind of seeing it for that and seeing why he or she might find that interesting. But it's more about kind of, you know, like this cancellation, like this you know, not like limitations in kind of like an intellectual sense, but limitations in a like, therefore I'm not going to take anything that that person has to offer. And that's really sad, and that just kind of reflects on why you know, it's not like I just woke up one morning and decided I wanted to, you know, entertain these kind of political spheres. And I think this is like one of the problems that like the mainstream does to itself with a lot of like these political demands. It's like, well, if you're worried about little Jimmy like hanging out on BitChute, or, you know, these like more esoteric websites than, you know, these big tech corps, you know, in the last 4 years, it's like, well, maybe if you actually gave little Jimmy a chance to express himself and not have to run off to the dark corners of the internet while he's super impressionable, because he wants to find, you know, content that's actually interesting. But yeah, so ultimately the very people that these kind of like cancel culture people are trying to help will ultimately continue to make the mush brain scenarios that, you know, they have to live with anyway. I know this video's this is kind of actually kind of a really dreary video, but I'm kind of feeling it today. The clouds are dark. It's kind of a more darker aesthetic on this video, and so I'm kind of liking the vibe of it, if you will. And yeah, so I think that art isn't just about pleasure and feeling good and um, this like calls for representation and stuff. Like this is ultimately just some pleasure dynamic, which is rooted in resentment to ultimately rob some other demographic of uh, something in some kind of like um, you know vision of progress. And I think that's one of the tropes that's funny about kind of left wing activists and how they navigate towards fictional characters, and so they look for these kind of like fictional representations, but it's fictional, so they don't act. So the character and like kind of the vision outside of just the realm of that film or series, like that's ultimately themselves, and so they're putting that in there, and they do that also with like the right and kind of like that ideological scarecrow that I've talked about, where they'll put this conservative like I was like seeing one of my friends, he shared this like esoteric kind of deep left page like post, and he was like asserting that like people on the dissident right are going around and they're reading oh fuck, what was it, something like Ted Kaczynski or something like the Unabomber or something. And I, like, don't get me wrong, like I'm not gonna say that people don't, and there's like not memes about that. I've been acquainted with some of his texts before, or his op-ed or whatever that he had published. But like the idea that there's just a bunch of right wingers just running around reading Ted and like just sitting in their basements and just working on bombs, I guess, and as if this is some big social problem. It's just like total farce and total manipulation. But yeah.